Most of us know the feeling of parking a vehicle somewhere and then forgetting where we've parked it, but we usually find our vehicles again after doing a little thinking about it. In most cases, the vehicles don't remain missing for decades. That's not always the case, though. Sometimes abandoned vehicles just stay abandoned, and strange things sometimes happen to them as a result. When most people think of Russia's attempts to defeat the United States of America in the space race, they think of the creation and failure of the Buran space shuttle. Most people know the story of the rocket that briefly went into space, but far fewer are aware that 2 more rockets are still waiting to be launched, hidden away in Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Unfortunately, given the length of time that the Cosmodrome has been abandoned for, it's reasonable to assume that they are never going to fly. Nobody seems to know what stage of completion these rockets were at before the decision was taken to down tools and stop working, but they appear to have all the right parts in all the right places. The exterior shells appear to be fully finished, and a glance into the cockpit reveals a whole array of glorious 1980s space-age technology that nobody ever got the chance to use. The years haven't been too kind to this decrepit facility, though. It's largely exposed to the elements, and the rockets are covered in bird droppings and graffiti. When Bolivia ordered a load of old steam trains from the United Kingdom in the early 20th century, it intended to use them as the starting point for a whole new train network. In the end, all they got was an accidental train graveyard. The trains are currently close to Uyuni on the Bolivian plains and are collectively known as the Cementerio de Trenes, literally the train cemetery. Uyuni was once an important railway connection point between many major South American cities, and the idea when buying the trains was to expand the station, add more lines, and add more services. Hundreds of trains were bought from the UK and shipped to Bolivia, but the Bolivian authorities then fell out with the contractors who were supposed to be building the expanded transport hub. Incredibly, neither side backed down, and the plan was abandoned, along with all of the expensive trains. They've been standing here unwanted ever since. The government was able to sell a few for scrap, but there are still more than 100 in the desert, getting battered by the region's notorious salt winds. Dalal in Ethiopia used to host both a railway station and an Italian sulfur mine. Now it hosts nothing at all, but the skeletal remains of its old cars, trucks, and even a few of its old railway carriages are still there. Dalal has been described as a ghost town, and that's a fair assessment. With most ghost towns, though, there's at least a trace of the old town left. With Dalal, there's almost nothing at all. Back when people lived here, it was the hottest inhabited place on Earth, with an average temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit between 1960 and 1966. The sulfur mine was built after the construction of a railway to Dalal from the port of Mersa Fatma in Eritrea in 1918. By 1929, more than 25,000 tons of sylvite had been mined and transported to Mersa Fatma by the railway. But the country's British administration ordered the dismantling of the railway after the end of the Second World War. The Dalal Company of Asmara tried to continue trading for a few years beyond that by selling salt to India, but had to give up the town in 1953. During the Second World War, the British Army made use of a reconnaissance and raiding unit called the Long Range Desert Group. The group used special two-wheel drive vehicles built for the task because they were lighter and required less fuel than four-wheel drive vehicles. Very few of the vehicles still exist, but there's one abandoned in the Egyptian desert not far from Siwa. It's been stuck there since April 1941. The vehicle is thought to have been left behind after developing a steering issue while on its way to Kufra in Libya, and today is half buried in the sand. It was stripped of all essential equipment at the time of its abandonment, but would once have been equipped with 11 Lewis machine guns, 4 Boys anti-tank rifles, and Bofors 37mm anti-tank gun. Some models also had a Vickers 50 caliber machine gun mounted at the rear of the vehicle, although it's unclear whether this relic in the desert was one of them. The creation of the Long Range Desert Group eventually forced the Italians to come up with a similar unit of their own, called the Auto Saharaina. Sticking with the theme of Soviet creations, would it be more accurate to call this next abandoned vessel a plane or a ship? It's an MD-160 Loon-class ekranoplan, built in the 1970s. It's also known as an Ukhta, but a ton of people prefer to call it the Caspian Sea Monster. This monstrous vessel is even bigger than a Boeing 747. Rather than taking off high into the sky, the Ukhta was designed to fly on an air cushion around 15 feet above sea level, which would have made it extremely difficult for enemy vessels to detect on approach. Nobody knows the precise details of what it got up to while it was still in service, but it was retired during the 1990s and stored at Kaspiyski Naval Base. More recently, it's been transported across the Caspian Sea to reach Derbent in Dagestan, where it's scheduled to be turned into a museum. This singular ekranoplan is understood to be the only model completed before the Soviet Union had to shut down its WIG program because of a lack of funds. While it's difficult to imagine a vessel of this size sneaking up on anybody, its low clearance above the water, coupled with its supersonic missiles, meant that by the time an enemy vessel saw it, it would already be too late. The Michelangelo da Vinci restaurant was supposed to be a 5-star, world-class restaurant with a theme like no other. It sat between two large planes positioned almost nose-to-nose in Villa Marzana, Italy. Things didn't go to plan. The restaurant closed down long ago, but the planes are still there. The restaurant plan was the bold vision of a man named Gigi Stecca. It was probably always doomed to failure because only 1,200 people live in Villa Marzana, far too few to support a grand restaurant of the kind that Gigi dreamed of. The eccentric businessman bought a former aircraft control tower, a helicopter, a Douglas DC-6, and a Tupolev Tu-134, and then decorated the interiors of the tower and the planes with replicas of works by Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. He even had a brewery on site and had nightly fish specials caught fresh from the sea. Unfortunately, he didn't get all the necessary approvals from local authorities for his unusual design. The government deemed him guilty of several zoning violations and forced him to close down in 2014. Without anyone to look after them, the planes have begun to decay. The Caspian Sea Monster wasn't the only Soviet-era attempt at making a seafaring plane. It might not even have been the most spectacular. We reserve that honor for the Beriv VVA-14, which was the brainchild of legendary Italian designer Robert Bartini. The idea behind the hulking plane was that it would be just as capable of taking and landing off from water as it was from land, and therefore could be adapted for either purpose. What the military really wanted was a plane that could fly low enough to take out enemy submarines, but also high enough to do battle in the sky. Bartini's design was capable of taking off and landing from the land without any issues, but making it work the same way on the water proved to be more problematic. The 1972 prototype had pontoons that were supposed to make water landings easy, but they were too rigid and weren't up to the task. Bartini passed away in 1974 before he could make a second prototype, and the Beriv VVA-14 was abandoned. It's now a curious exhibit at the Soviet Central Air Force Museum. If hunting down abandoned aircraft is your thing, then Tucson, Arizona, USA might be the best place in the world for you to go and indulge in your hobby. There are over 4,000 planes parked at the city's notorious aircraft Boneyard, and some of them have been there since the 1940s. Originally known as Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, the facility opened in 1946 as somewhere for the Air Force to store their disused B-29 bombers and C-47 transport planes. It grew from there, and it's still growing today. By the 1990s, the main job of the Boneyard's employees was breaking down and scrapping over 300 obsolete B-52 bombers. Today, you'll find F-16 fighter jets and A-10 Thunderbolt II ground attack jets also at the site. Some of the planes are here temporarily, rather than permanently, because the Boneyard does renovation and repair work, as well as scrapping and dismantling. The work can get a little greasy and dirty, but visitors are still welcome. Guided tours are available via booking on the facility's official website, but the site is so large that you can't realistically expect to see every plane parked there in a single visit. If you ever find yourself driving down the I-4 between Orlando and Tampa in Florida, USA, and you think you see a series of chrome trailers wedged into the ground in an open field, your eyes aren't deceiving you. That's Airstream Ranch, and it's exactly what it looks like. Opinion on whether it's a brilliant work of modern art or an eyesore varies dramatically in the surrounding area of Seffner, but the series of half-buried trailers was implanted into the ground by Frank Bates in 2008. Frank owned an RV dealership nearby and wanted to create something special to mark the 75th anniversary of his company. It's a loose replica of the Cadillac Ranch in Amarillo, Texas. There are 8 silver trailers in the field, and at one point, hundreds of tourists used to stop off and take pictures of the unusual sight. Unfortunately, Frank didn't perform any maintenance work on the trailers after he buried them. They quickly went from shiny silver to a battered-off gray, and the local authorities ordered him to tear them down. This wasn't a battle Frank was prepared to lose, though. He's managed to navigate around the problem by creating an Airstream museum on the site instead. There are 2 questions you'll find yourself asking when you visit Carhenge in Alliance, Nebraska. The first is, how is this done? And the second is, why? The strange site was created by a conceptual artist named Jim Reinders, who was heavily inspired by the famous historic site of Stonehenge in England. He didn't want to use heavy stones for his sacred circle, though. Instead, he used old and unwanted cars. The result is a site that replicates the layout of Stonehenge in every way, but with steel in place of stone. As an example, in the place where you'll find Stonehenge's heel stone, at Carhenge, you'll find a 1962 Cadillac. Residents of the small town of Alliance, which is where Carhenge was created, were initially skeptical about their new artistic feature. Over time, they've grown to love it and the tourism industry which has grown up around it. Carhenge was officially dedicated during the summer solstice in June 1987, but it didn't gain an official visitor center to assist tourists until 2006. Jim eventually donated the site of Carhenge to a group called Friends of Carhenge in 2011. But it's officially belonged to the citizens of Alliance since 2013. In 1947, a B-29 known as Keybird landed on a frozen lake in Greenland. Almost 50 years later, a volunteer team of aircraft enthusiasts and experts attempted to fly her back off it, and they very nearly succeeded. The Super Fortress plane was forced to land due to a pilot error in February 1947. The pilot made a mess of navigation and then ran out of fuel trying to correct it. The landing was safe and the crew was unharmed, but the Keybird couldn't be recovered. In 1994, experienced aircraft racing pilot and scrap plane builder Darrell Greenamer arrived at the scene with a team of people determined to get it off the ground again. He set about replacing the propellers and engines, fitted new tires, and set about fixing the control surfaces, but the weather turned against the team and they were out of time for the year. Darrell and friends came back in 1995 and finished the job, and so the Keybird was prepared for takeoff on May 21st that year from a specially built runway. Sadly, the jury-rigged fuel tank for the auxiliary power unit began leaking aviation fuel directly into the plane almost immediately. Darrell and his crew escaped before flames engulfed the fuselage, but the damage was done. Keybird was destroyed. What's left of the crumpled wreck is still visible on the Greenland ice cap and is sometimes photographed from above. Treating a ship the way that the MS Mediterranean Sky has been treated ought to be a crime. In fact, it is a crime in some parts of the world. We're including a few pictures of the ship from its glory days so you can get a feel for how beautiful it once looked. Today, stuck on the coast of Greece's Gulf of Elefsina, it's unrecognizable. This proud old vessel was known as the City of York when it launched as a brand new top-of-the-range ocean liner in 1953, but was renamed in 1982 after it was acquired by new owners. The vessel had lost a little of its sparkle after 3 decades on the ocean, and so it was repurposed as a transport ship. The Mediterranean Sky served its new owners well for 15 years, until the parent company went bankrupt, necessitating the seizure of all its assets. That included the Mediterranean Sky. The insolvency company dealing with the bankruptcy of the ship's owners deemed her to be worthless, so she was simply towed to the Gulf of El Efsina and effectively dumped there in 1999. She began to sink in 2002 and capsized in 2003. Shouldn't this count as a deliberate act of pollution? Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!